Chelsea Manning is the former US Army soldier who in 2013 was sentenced to 35 years in prison for leaking classified documents to WikiLeaks in 2010. At the time, she was Bradley Manning. She was working as an intel analyst in Iraq. He transitioned to female while in prison. President Obama commuted Manning's sentence, and she was released last year. She's speaking in Auckland and Wellington next month. I asked her if her recent bid for a Senate seat in Maryland was a genuine bid or a protest candidacy.
I would say it's a mixture of the two. I remember bringing my campaign staff on board early on in the campaign whenever we had a lot of initial interest in the campaign. And I remember that we all sat down together and we all were discussing, what direction we wanted to take it in. And so we had two different options, change our positions to become, to fit what, some surveys or polls might suggest, or to stick to our principles and go with the things that we actually believed. And every single one of us came to a consensus and agreed to put forward a campaign platform that we truly believed in. So yes, in one sense, we were serious. And in another sense, we didn't want to be unprincipled. We didn't want to become changed or artificial by the process.
No, well, you might have figured that a platform of abolishing prisons and abolishing the immigrations and customs enforcement might have ensured that you weren't going to get in the Senate, right?
I don't know that.
That's the way it came about, though, isn't it?
No, I don't believe so.
So, what do you think lost you the vote?
I did pretty well for those positions, I believe.
So, are you going to do it again?
I haven't decided whether or not to do it again. Because going up against an incumbent is more than an uphill climb.
Sure.
In the American primary system. In a contested election, if a contested election comes over a seat, over a vacant seat, I might, that might be a more realistic possibility. But it's going to depend on where I am in my life and where I stand and what I'm doing, and also the state of the country at the time.
I'm assuming, Chelsea, that you regard the moment you decided to leak the documents that you had compiled in Iraq, that you regard that moment as the pivotal moment of your life?
No, I would say the pivotal moment of my life. The pivotal moment of my life really happened. It happened in November of 2008. So in 2008, Proposition 8 was passed. That was a referendum in the state of California to really, marriage equality had been brought on the table in California, and so queer people were able to get married to opposite sex partners, and really, this was a referendum to reverse that, and it passed. And whenever this referendum passed, it was shocking, and it was earth-shattering for me, because in effect, this is a system that allowed 52% of voters in the state of California to involuntarily divorce 11,000 people. That was the way it felt at the time. And so this was a very earth-shattering moment in my understanding of the world and where I sit in it, and the fact that the world that I live in, that I'm a part of it. I'm not just floating in it, and that history isn't standing still. It's not always constantly in the past.
Now, I'm interested that you say that was a pivotal moment in your life, and not the moment that subsequently led to you being found guilty of espionage and theft and sentenced to 35 years in prison, some of which you served.
If you know me, then you know me well, then it would be easier to understand, I think.
Give me a bit of insight then.
I've been living as a queer and trans person for many years. first as openly queer and later as trans, and that's who I am, and that's been a very common denominator in the struggles that I've had throughout my life. I've been homeless. I was really driven into going into the military in part because of the life struggles I was going through, but also because I wanted to get rid of my transness, per se, and not to be this more manly man kind of to meet these masculine expectations. And when you're living when you're living this life, everything is a struggle. Every step of my life has been a struggle. It's been a struggle to survive through school. It was a struggle to survive through early adulthood. Being homeless and working, several jobs to be able to pay, just to be able to scrounge to maybe go to college, being in the military, to going into Iraq, and then going into prison, solitary confinement, and then to seek, the adequate medical treatment for a trans person while in prison. And so all of these, and I'm really fighting now to grapple with all of this and to figure out how I fit in the world now. So this is, no single moment or decision defines me in that way.
No, and I'm imagining that it must be very difficult because you are this figurehead either for anti-US military or pro-LGBTI, and both of those are kind of pigeonholes, right?
I've certainly been broader in the issues that I talk about. I talk about healthcare. I talk about, and I think it's really important that we talk about, and we really move a lot of these what people call fringe issues into the foray, into the mainstream, because they're not fringe if you're actually talking about them. So it's a number of things. Immigration is a huge one. I'm been very critical of the American immigration system. I do think that we should abolish ICE, for instance, and
which is the Immigrations and Customs Enforcement.
Right. So yes, it is Immigrations and Customs Enforcement, and there's a sister agency, the Customs and Border Patrol, or CBP. These agencies are effectively, conducting an active ethnic cleansing in the United States as it stands, especially under the last two administrations.
Were you politicized in Iraq to these issues?
No, I was politicized to these issues following, the passage of Proposition 8.
So why? I mean, I understand when you say you were driven into the military. I suspect your father had a lot to do with it in order to kind of become more macho. But apart from anything else, how would your politics have allowed you to enter the military at that point?
I mean, at that age, I was kind of apathetic. I didn't really have an opinion on politics. What I saw every day was what was happening. On every day, the evening news, which meant a lot more in the U.S. back then, was all about what was happening in Iraq and the spiraling out of control sense that people had about what was happening in Iraq, and the debate really swirled around the insurgency and the surge and the civil war that was sort of simmering between Sunni and Shia groups in the country at the time. And I really just wanted to be a part of something, and I wanted to make a difference. And I was kind of hitting two birds with one stone by dealing with the macho stuff and also dealing with being a part of something, and maybe and actually thinking hey, maybe I can make a difference. Maybe I can be a part of this.
Do you think you made a difference now?
It's hard to say. I try to make a difference in the world I'm in, wherever I am, and sometimes it feels like I'm not making a difference, and sometimes it feels like at the very least I can have an influence on people, whether it's students or people who follow me on Twitter, or friends and family.
Do you think that it's fair to say that if you hadn't identified as gay for the large part and later as a woman, you would not have been able to stand outside the system sufficiently to do that leak?
I don't believe that they're connected in that way. I do think that certainly the experience that I went through, certainly opened my eyes up a little bit more. But that could happen with anyone. I don't think that there's a direct cause and effect relationship here. But yeah, I would say that for me personally, that time period was a period of realization and really coming to grips with an understanding of the world, but also not just one that is factual, one that is more ethical and moral and more complex and more human.
This may sound like a naive question, I guess, but was there any way you could have addressed your concerns about what the US military was doing in Iraq internally without dumping a relatively indiscriminate number of documents on WikiLeaks?
Well, I wouldn't first off, I wouldn't characterize it as dumping. The answer is no. The U.S. and in many instances other countries have similar systems as well, have systems that really discourage dissent within the institution. And actually, a lot of people outside of government and the military don't realize this, but the official channels, the proper channels, if you will, are actually a weapon. They're a tool that's used against you. There's actually a program called the Insider Threat Program, and
the Insider Threat Program.
Right, the Insider Threat Program is a U.S. government program that if you raise or if you raise suspicions or you raise doubts or you raise concerns about something, you are automatically flagged for investigation by the Insider Threat Program, and that can have that can bring administrative measures. It can bring you administrative scrutiny. It can mean surveillance by counterintelligence. It can mean being fired or losing your job or being moved to a different position where you don't have access to things. So really, there is no way, and the official channels are actually the most dangerous place that you can go to.
What was it that you wrote to then President Obama that convinced him to commute your sentence, do you think?
I have no idea. I want to believe that he actually read my letter. I want to believe that. I don't want to believe that this was some, politically calculated move or some, decision made by a lawyer or some, arbitrary analysis, I want to believe that it was more than that.
Well, he didn't really. It was sufficiently late in his presidency for him to have nothing politically to gain from commuting a sentence, presumably.
And any president is obviously concerned with their legacy and their last days of office.
Right.
But I want to believe that wasn't the case here.
Were you disappointed that he did not pardon you?
Well, I didn't ask for a pardon, so I didn't expect to get commuted either. I only asked for a commutation, but
would you ever ask for a pardon? Do you think you should be pardoned?
Well, all I asked for was a commutation.
Yeah, but do you think you should be pardoned?
Well, that's not my decision to make, but I did request for, I asked for clemency, when I first got out for 10 years, for 10 years, and then whenever I submitted my petition, it was for a commutation.
And when that came through, when the news came through, presumably it was huge relief on your part.
If you've never been to prison for a long time, you might think that. But when you're in prison for a long time, and I've spent most of my adult life in prison, so I'm more used to prison than I am, the outside world here. And this is more of a new experience for me being out here. It's actually scary because you're really being uprooted in your entire understanding of the world after being in prison for 7 years. I was institutionalized. I'm somebody who spent, a year in solitary confinement and 6 years in general population in prison. in order to survive in that environment, you adapt to that environment. And it is a major adjustment and major change, and quite dramatic for you to be suddenly released. And especially because I had come to terms with, by this time, by 7 years in, you kind of know that you're going to be in prison for a long time, and you just you adjust and you adapt to that. So this was a very sudden change, and also like you tend to get more when you've been in prison for a while. You think more realistically. You don't think miracles are going to happen.
So as soon as you got out, what happened?
Yeah, I spent a few days sort of in the countryside with my lawyers to decompress a little bit. And then I moved temporarily. I basically spent a couple months in New York City, and those few weeks really affected my understanding of the world out here today. I noticed just how much we've kind of built a prison out. In America, we've really built a prison out here. I see many of the same things that you would see in prison. Constant policing over minor rules, a brutal and violent police state, surveillance everywhere, cameras everywhere. These are the hallmarks of prison, but they're also normal out here. And so with many of the fears that I had for going to prison was that, that we would eventually go down this path, and we largely have. Our obsession with security and safety has largely eroded all forms of political dissent into being relegated elsewhere. And also, if you're a minority group, you're really marginalized to such an extent now that you have. We largely live in a domestic military occupation in the United States, and this has been the case for years for many groups of people, but it has intensified and accelerated in recent years. And we've brought a lot of these lessons back, in my opinion, from Iraq and Afghanistan, where we brought this counterinsurgency mentality into our own streets.
Tell me this, Chelsea. You've been freed from prison. You are a woman now. You have been revered by many for your position not only on freedom of information, but also transgender rights. Are you happy?
I'm not going to say I'm happy, but I certainly have moments of joy, and I have moments of pleasure, and I have moments of love and unity and compassion, usually with the people that I care about the most. I was just in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, with a large group of students, and we, in one of the most powerful moments in my life, I witnessed a Confederate statue being taken down by a number of students, and moments like this bring me immense joy and inspiration, and truly make me feel optimistic about the future. And I'm glad to have been able to witness that.
Do you hope that your celebrity status, which I know has been very difficult to deal with, getting out of prison, it was a huge, onslaught of attention, if you like. Do you hope that celebrity status will diminish over time, or do you think you'll be able to capitalize on it more wholeheartedly?
That's a very tough question to answer. I'm not used to this status. This is very new to me. That said, like any other really intense and highly restrictive role that I've had in my life, I've had to adapt to it. And I certainly hope that I can find a balance. As long as I do have a platform, I want to use it for the right reasons.
Are you able to reassure people that you're okay now? I mean, there were concerns in May that you were showing signs of distress, not to say suicidal tendencies. I don't know whether you agree with that. I don't know whether you're prepared to divulge what happened.
Right. I'm dealing with a lot, certainly. I had a very stressful time and kind of a low moment in the last few months.
For any particular reason?
Oh, well, it's everything.
Yeah.
It's it's being bombarded by this new world and everything else. I'm definitely much better, but that's after a lot of therapy. So really, do I deal with anxiety? Yes. Do I deal with depression? Yes. Am I going to be dealing with these symptoms for years, along with post-traumatic stress? Yes. I'm still functional. I still am able to do the work that I do. And a lot of people who are public figures that I see and I talk to on a regular basis have a lot of the same issues. So mine are just a little bit more intense at the moment because of the sudden change that's happened in my life. But I'm not ashamed of that or afraid to talk about it.
The leaks that you did from Iraq, were the notoriety of them, if you like, was compounded by the fact that you made them to WikiLeaks, and WikiLeaks has its own issues of controversy since then, because it was a fairly embryonic form at that point. Is there any regret on your part that it was WikiLeaks who ended up running the stuff you released?
I mean, I tend not to try to relitigate, especially the hindsight of 2020 kind of mentality that I think a lot of folks have. I just remember how much I struggled in that time to find an outlet. I went to the New York Times. I first went to the Washington Post, but then I went to the New York Times, and there was a technology barrier that I think is important. In the context of this is 2010. There wasn't a significant amount of understanding of encryption and the importance of protecting your digital data and of how vulnerable plain text communications actually are. And it was very difficult for me to be able to communicate with say a Washington Post reporter who asks simply, "Why don't you call me on the phone and talk about it?" Whenever in reality that's probably not the best way to go about it. So it's really just it's more of like an alignment of history in the fact that they were in a very embryonic state. This small group of people, many of whom have left since then. I made the decision that I made at the time based upon the tools and resources I had, and also the limited time that I had. I was running out of time. I only have access to this information for so long, and also there's a war going on, and so it's very important that that it be made public, in an impactful manner and in a reasonable amount of time, in a relevant amount of time.
That's Chelsea Manning, who's going to be in New Zealand, speaking in Auckland and Wellington, September the 8th and September the 9th.